welcome to all of you in the second episode of the webinar for the month of March. This episode is about the glass is half full, educating excluded learner in inclusive classrooms in Pakistan. Dear audience, I hope you will respect the protocols of the webinar. Please use the chat box for your questions and your comments. This webinar is being recorded and presented through live stream that you can find through the sources of social media of University of Education. Dear audience, I'm delighted to introduce you with Dr. Amae Sharma. Very warm welcome, Doctor.
Hi.
Dr. Sharma is a professor in the Faculty of Education at Monash University, Australia, where he is the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion. Dr. Umesh research program in the area of disability and inclusive education span India, Pakistan, China, Bangladesh, Fiji, Solomon Island, and as well as Canada, US, New Zealand, and Australia. He has conducted several award winning national and international projects on topics, for instance, funding of education for students with disability for the Commonwealth of Australia. He has also received several awards for his contribution to academia, including the Dean's Award for Excellence in Innovation and External Collaboration in 2012, the Dean's Award for Research Impact in 2016, and the Dean's Award for Research Enterprise in 2017. He has authored over 150 academic articles, book chapters, and edited books that focus on various aspects of inclusive education. His co-authored book, A Guide to Promoting a Positive Classroom Environment, was the recipient of the International Book Prize Award for the Exceptionality Education International. Dear audience, Dr. Sharma is going to talk about the inclusive education. That means all children in the same classroom, in the same school. Inclusion is a term which expresses the commitment to provide a quality education in mainstream school for every child to the maximum extent possible. It involves bringing support services to the child rather than moving the child to the services, and means that the child will benefit from being in the class. Providing quality education in an inclusive setting is a challenging job, but it can be achieved by developing strategic association and networks with like-minded organizations, building public-private partnership, and undertaking joined-up advocacy to raise the awareness of those responsible for service delivery. Dr. Sharma talk is uplifting the inclusive practices in the context of Pakistan. And let's begin our talk. Thank you. And over to you, Dr. Mesh.
Thank you very much. First of all, namaskar, assalamu alaikum, and I think I'm so delighted to be talking to all of you. And I'll try to speak both Hindi, English, as well as Urdu. I'll try my Urdu as well today. And I'll be very, very happy if you feel like, posting your question during the chat or maybe later on. But I think it's important to share if you feel like anything that I'm talking is not making sense. I'll be very, very happy to make sure that you understand what I'm talking about. Let's see if I do this. No, not that. Can you see what I'm presenting or not yet?
Yeah, something is coming. Yeah, that's perfect now.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about glass is always half full, educating excluded learner in inclusive classrooms in Pakistan. So before I start, I must say that I'm not an expert on inclusive education in Pakistan, but I have done a lot of research in many countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, China. So that gives me, I think, some degree of confidence to say the kind of ideas that I'm going to share will make some sense to you, and hopefully it will be, give you some ideas how about go about educating learners with disabilities. तो सबसे पहले I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm calling you from, or कहाँ से मैं बोल रहा हूँ. I'm right now talking from Melbourne, Australia, which is, I would say it's like 4 p.m. in Australia, and I think it's around 10:35 in Pakistan, if I'm not wrong. Is that right?
Yeah, it's 10:05.
Okay, 10:05. Good morning to all of you. So first important thing is, I think all of you may know Australia for cricket, and Melbourne is located in that big city where we play a lot of cricket, so MCG. Australia is also famous for lots of other things. They are famous for kangaroos and koalas. So I'd like to welcome all of you from this part of the world to say, well, it's good to get connection back to the audience in Pakistan. So I am located here in Victoria right now, and I'm calling from Melbourne. My talk is about glass. I'm going to talk about glass a lot today. So is glass half full or half empty? And what does it mean? When we talk about inclusion or children with disabilities, 99% of the time, people come up with an image. एक बच्चे को disability है यार, इसको कैसे पढ़ाएंगे regular school के अंदर? So it's not easy. It's a very, very hard job. And I do acknowledge it. But what I believe, if we really want to move forward, we can't do it unless we start seeing things differently. So there are two parts to my presentation. Think about जैसे movie देखने जाते हैं ना, दो part होता है, एक movie interval के पहले चलती है और एक interval के बाद. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to talk interval से पहले. going to give you the glass is half empty. Interval के बाद glass is half full. So पहले I'll tell you more challenges क्या हैं. And second part के अंदर I'll tell you what are the solutions, including in countries like Pakistan में क्या कर सकते हैं. So the first part of my presentation, so this is what I want to do. As I told you, I want to talk about the challenges first, the problems. Second part में solutions, what can we do about it. So first, let's understand one of the biggest challenge. I think this is true not only for Pakistan but all over the world. One problem is how we understand what is inclusion is a challenge in most countries, and I'll tell you why. What is the problem? So how we understand inclusion is a significant barrier for us to implement inclusion, and I'm going to share with you some of the definitions that we use and what's wrong with them. So I think this is what you would have heard, or most people around the world, this is what people talk about when they say inclusion. Inclusion is educating learners with and without disabilities together in regular classrooms. तो इसका मतलब ये है कि जो बच्चे जिनको डिसेबिलिटी है, उन बच्चों को रेगुलर स्कूल के अंदर, जिन बच्चों को डिसेबिलिटी नहीं है, दोनों को साथ साथ पढ़ाया जाए, इसको हम इंक्लूजन बोलते हैं. और काफी कंट्रीज के अंदर, बहुत सी कंट्रीज के अंदर इंक्लूजन इज लेजिस्लेटेड. दे हैव पॉलिसीज और दे हैव लेजिस्लेशन. And I believe Pakistan maybe you have legislation or policies to support inclusion कि भाई हमें include करना चाहिए बच्चों को. Or what people also talk about that inclusion is the responsibility of all school personnel. So that's the kind of ideas in most countries we talk about inclusion. Okay. World Bank they have done this. They've been doing research for many years. But what they realize, we have not been able to include kids with disabilities for many reasons. But they have identified 4 major causes or barriers to inclusion. This is the reason we can't do inclusion. Number 1 is attitudes. Number 2, training. Number 3, policies. Number 4, support. I'll tell you more about all 4 of them a little later. And I'll explain it to you, what does it mean in Pakistan's context. What I also want to acknowledge, there is a very great work being done by many researchers in Pakistan, and people from Pakistan talking about, or in Asian region. And these are some of the names. I think Nidhi Singhal has done some work in Pakistan. Tariq from Bangladesh, he has written about it. I think Itfaq Khali Khan ने भी काफी काम किया पाकिस्तान के अंदर. And Sadia, you have done some work on inclusion in Pakistan. Saiful Malak, Richard Rose. But in the center, I have a cartoon. This cartoon means there are many other people that I don't know. So I want to just say sorry if I have forgotten you. My idea is not to list all the authors, but I do want to acknowledge the great work being done by many researchers when we talk about inclusion. So they have talked about, all these people have talked about what are the barriers, why we can't do it. So it's important for you to understand the kind of research they have done makes really important, and we do need that kind of research, and we do need to understand the kind of research we have done in this country or in Pakistan. Now the next question is, वर्ल्ड बैंक तो बोलता है कि भाई ये 4 बैरियर्स हैं, क्या पाकिस्तान में भी ये चारों बैरियर्स हैं या नहीं है? And this is a question many people will ask. Is that true for Pakistan or not? So do we have problem with attitudes? Do we have problem with our training, the way we train our teachers and special educators, school principals? क्या हमारी policies में भी कुछ problem है, or can we do something better? And do teachers and school leaders get enough support to implement inclusion or not? So these are the 4 major challenges. And what I want to tell you, actually, what we know from the research conducted so far in Pakistan, this is also true in Pakistan. You do also face the same barriers, but it's possible the extent and intensity in barriers ki ya to zyada hai ya kam hai. I would say it's more on a higher side. You still have problem with attitudes, still have problem with training, policies and support. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about what do these 4 barriers mean, like when I'm talking about these barriers. So attitudes का मतलब ये हुआ कि when we talk about teachers, teacher educators, school leaders, they think inclusion is a great idea, but it's not easy for us to implement. So they are worried about it. Like, that's the attitude kind of thing. Yeah, अच्छा, बहुत अच्छी idea, लेकिन it's very difficult to implement. So attitudinal barriers are, it may not work for this particular child or a child with a, more disability or more severe disability. Training का सबसे बड़ा problem, which is true, I can tell you with lot of degree of confidence. I mean, I'm talking about, I've done a lot of research in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and China. Most universities do a very good job of teaching theory of how inclusive education. We talk about what is inclusion, why we should do it. And to some extent, we do talk about some degree of the kind of teaching strategies we should use in our classroom. So theory बहुत अच्छे से cover करते हैं. लेकिन जो practice होती है, how to do it in the classroom, that's where we fail. And this is also true not only for Pakistan, this is also true for many countries, including in Australia, it happens sometimes. हम बोलते हैं कि ऐसे करना चाहिए, but जो टीचर्स ट्रेनिंग में होते हैं उनको नहीं पता कि क्लास में जाके कैसे अप्लाई करना है जो सारा कुछ हमने यूनिवर्सिटी से सीखा है. पॉलिसीज की सबसे बड़ी प्रॉब्लम ये है, एंड आई थिंक दिस इज आल्सो ट्रू नॉट ओनली फॉर पाकिस्तान बट मैनी अदर कंट्रीज. पॉलिसीज आपको ये बोलती है कि करना क्या है, कभी ये नहीं बोलती हाउ टू डू इट. दे टेल यू व्हाट टू डू, दे विल नेवर टेल यू हाउ टू डू इट. एंड दैट्स अ बिग प्रॉब्लम इन मोस्ट कंट्रीज, इंक्लूडिंग आई थिंक इन पाकिस्तान. एंड द लास्ट बैरियर इज वेरी क्रिटिकल व्हिच इज सपोर्ट. अगर कोई टीचर या स्कूल प्रिंसिपल विश्वास करते हैं, सोचते हैं हाँ हमें करना चाहिए इंक्लूजन, इस बच्चे को इंक्लूड करना चाहिए, उनको पूरी सपोर्ट नहीं मिलती. कभी तो पॉलिसी मेकर से नहीं मिलती, कभी डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ एजुकेशन से नहीं मिलती, कभी कम्युनिटी से नहीं मिलती. तो सपोर्ट इज ऑल्सो अ बिग बैरियर इन सभी व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट इंक्लूजन. I just want to know if I'm making any sense, or are there any questions at this stage. So feel free to say thumbs up or no questions, or questions, whatever you feel like. So what do we do? I mean, the next question is, I talked about barriers up to now. Problem क्या है हमारे अंदर? So क्या करें? I mean, you did not come to hear all the barriers again in this presentation, because already there are lots of barriers. So you need to move thinking forward. What else can be done? So this is where the intermission starts. The movie this is the second part of the movie, or this is the second part of my presentation. And now I'll talk about glass is always half full. And I'm going to share some of the practices that if you apply them in Pakistan, actually you can create an inclusive classroom system, or inclusive in your school system. So there are some of the quotes I'm going to share. I think you need to pay attention to them, because that will help you to rethink about how to do it. If you always do what you have always done, you will always get what you will always got. So अगर आप करते रहेंगे जैसे करते आए हैं अब तक, आप आगे नहीं चल सकते उस तरीके से. You need to start thinking differently. You need to start thinking of नए तरीका क्या है इसको ठीक करने. हम लोग how do we make it happen in our country or in our system. First of all, I'm going to say, first you need to redefine inclusion for your own context. The way I defined was problematic, and this is the first task I'm going to do with all of you, or for you. तो मेरे हिसाब से inclusion this is the very first lesson I want to share with you. Inclusion is about providing high quality education to all learners, not to some learners. The most important thing. The second thing is, inclusion is everyone's responsibility, not just school personnel, community का भी बहुत बड़ा role होता है. Community plays an important role. Sometimes politicians play an important role. Sometimes, I mean, you need to think about it. Parents also play very, very important role. Parents of children with and without disabilities to make it happen. The third thing is inclusion may look different in different schools, but it means we acknowledge and value diversity in our schools. इसका मतलब ये है कि हम अपने स्कूल में अगर बच्चों का अलग 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 तरीके के बच्चे आएंगे, कुछ बच्चों को अलग तरीके से सुनते हैं, कुछ अलग तरीके से देखते हैं, कुछ अलग तरीके से समझते हैं. We should appreciate, we should feel that's good. And actually अगर आप if you look around in your school, you will find अलग अलग तरीके के बच्चे, उनके में strength होती है. They have different strengths. Inclusion requires you to start believing in that diversity is your strength for your system. So what I also want to talk about, actually, I think, I don't know how many of you use that in your teacher education. Islam has talked a lot about disability and inclusion. So for those people who are in teacher education, I request you to start thinking about, when you are teaching about inclusion, do you use this kind of literature when you are talking about inclusion in your programs? And there is a lot of great stuff. People have, researchers, scholars have talked about of inclusion in your programs. So I just want to give you an example. We were in Pakistan, in China last year, and I was talking about how to do inclusion in Chinese schools. So I was surprised how many people were using Confucius philosophy when they talk about inclusion. And actually Confucius has talked a lot about inclusion. And most of the time people look for solutions to inclusion coming from other countries. They say, well, let's learn it from Australia, or let's learn it from, US, how they're doing it, and then we'll apply it. But most countries, they already have a lot of strength in their own system. So what I mean is, when we start changing our schools, we need to pay attention to the kind of stuff we are doing really well in our schools as we start moving forward. So अपने context, अपने country, अपने culture को नहीं भूलना चाहिए. That's what I mean as we start talking about inclusion. So there is a good quote. I mean, I found it so powerful when you talk about inclusion in China, that our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. What does it mean? It's a student, if he fails all the time, student is always looking for, how can I get through this challenge? If it's a teacher, how best I can help this particular student. And I think same thing, some of the research that I have done looking into some of the aspects, which I was surprised. I mean, not only surprised, I knew about this, but I thought I'll do some more research. I found that Quran talks about inclusion a lot. Quran talks about how to teach vulnerable people in our society. How do you serve those people in our society? So and I'm not an expert on Quran at all, but I want to talk about, there are some great examples and strategies already in Quran talking about inclusion that we should think about when we teach about inclusion in our preschool programs. And there is this quote that I'm going to say, or the true justice described in the Quran commands men to behave justly, not discriminating people, protecting others' rights, and not permitting violence, no matter what the circumstance, to side with the oppressed, against the oppressor, and to help the needy. The main idea is, if you have a student who is struggling in your classroom, to help them is almost like serving the God. That's the kind of idea Quran talks about, and that's everyone's responsibility. And I'm talking about, it happens in many countries. Like, you go anywhere in the world, you'll find those pearls of wisdom. I think you need to start looking at what do our society talks about, what are the kinds of things we can take from our own context. And there's another great article written by Maisa S. Bazna. She talks about the Quran concentrates on the notion of disadvantage that is created by society. It says that societies can sometimes create barriers to people with disabilities or people who have disadvantage. And this is our responsibility of the society to create a system where we can address those barriers that we face in our society to provide education to those learners. And I will strongly recommend to read those articles, because I think there are some really great ideas as you move forward. So the most important idea is, if you want to move forward with inclusion, consider the strengths of the local system before importing new ideas. So that's the important message. What is the strength of our system? What is the strength of Pakistan as you start implementing inclusive education as you move forward? The next thing is, inclusion cannot occur unless we fix all our classes and schools. I think what it's a very important idea. Inclusion के बारे में जब लोग बोलते हैं ना, let's do inclusion. इंक्लूजन जब तक नहीं हो सकता जब तक हम अपने स्कूल के अंदर जो ऑलरेडी जो बच्चे आ रहे हैं उनको अच्छी एजुकेशन प्रोवाइड करना शुरू करें. आई थिंक दैट द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट आइडिया इज इंक्लूजन डज नॉट मीन कि भाई एक बच्चे को लाके इस स्कूल के अंदर क्लासरूम के अंदर इंक्लूड करें जहां पे पहले वाले उनसे बच्चे वही खुश नहीं, उनको ही नहीं अच्छी एजुकेशन मिल रही है. इंक्लूजन इज नॉट गोइंग टू वर्क. सो दिस इज एन इंपॉर्टेंट आइडिया फॉर अस टू रिमेंबर. सो थिंक अबाउट दिस. अगर एज यू कैन सी देयर इज अ ब्रोकन सिस्टम हियर, broken school system, and then inclusion is on top of this. So that's where how inclusion is happening right now. Agar you have a broken system, wahan pe education is good, and you bring in inclusion is going to fail. So that's why we talk about, when we talk about inclusion, what can we do to fix what's happening already here as we move forward. So it's important for us to start thinking about, start providing really good education to children who are already in our system. And that's part of our definition. Inclusion means इन बच्चों को जो ऑलरेडी हमारे स्कूल में ऑलरेडी है ना, इनको अच्छी से अच्छी एजुकेशन प्रोवाइड करना, तभी इंक्लूजन होगा. अगर हम इन बच्चों को इग्नोर कर देंगे और फिर इंक्लूजन करेंगे, इंक्लूजन इज नॉट गोइंग टू हैपन. सो दैट्स द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट आइडिया. सो दैट्स व्हाट आई मीनिंग. आई थिंक वी नीड टू फिक्स दिस स्कूल सिस्टम फर्स्ट बिफोर वी स्टार्ट टॉकिंग अबाउट इंक्लूजन. The third important thing, as I talk about, when we need to redefine inclusion, अब तक जितना मैंने रिसर्च पढ़ा है और जहां पे मैं डेफिनेशन पढ़ता हूँ, लोग बोलते हैं कि inclusion is extra burden. It's a burden. It's a good idea, but it's burden for teachers. I think that's a mistake. Again, we have made. From my point of view, inclusion is an opportunity, and unfortunately, people who do not get this opportunity are not great teachers, in my view. So think about, अगर आप ड्राइवर हैं, अगर आपको मान लो इस्लामाबाद के अंदर या लाहौर या कराची में मेन कहीं भी ऐसी जगह पे जाके गाड़ी ड्राइव करनी है जहाँ पे बहुत ट्रैफिक है, अगर आपने वहां पे कभी गाड़ी नहीं चलाई तो आप, मेरे ख्याल से आपको ड्राइविंग और सीखना जरूरी है. अगर ऑन द अदर हैंड, इफ यू हैव ड्रिवन कार्स ऑन अ रोड वेयर देयर इज नो ट्रैफिक, यू कैन इजीली ड्राइव इट. सो इंक्लूजन का मतलब ये हुआ कि जब आपको ज्यादा डिफिकल्टी होगी तो आप अच्छे ड्राइवर बन जाएंगे. अगर आपने इस्लामाबाद, कराची, लाहौर जहां पे कंजेस्टेड रोड है वहां पे गाड़ी चलाना सीख लिया है तो गांव में बड़े आराम से चला पाएंगे, कहीं पे भी चला पाएंगे. तो इस हिसाब से इंक्लूजन एक अपॉर्चुनिटी है जहां पे बच्चों का लर्निंग स्टाइल अलग है, समझने का संग अलग है. अगर आप उन बच्चों को पढ़ा पा रहे हैं अच्छे से, आप किसी भी कहीं पे भी पढ़ा सकते हैं बच्चों को. तो ये दिस इज द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट आइडिया. सो उनको किसी को भी तालीम दे सकते हैं अच्छी. दिस इज व्हाट आई वांट टू हाईलाइट. So the next important idea, inclusion may look different in different schools, but it means we acknowledge and value diversity in our schools. This is what happens जब हम यूनिवर्सिटी में प्रिपेयर करते हैं अपने टीचर्स को. बोलते हैं भाई ऐसे पढ़ाना है मैथमेटिक्स, आपको अर्थमेटिक ऐसे पढ़ाना है, लिटरेसी ऐसे पढ़ाना है, उर्दू ऐसे पढ़ाना है, और सोचते सबके सब बच्चे एक ही तरीके से समझेंगे. बट रियलिटी ये है कि हर बच्चा अलग है. ये जो राइट साइड में, दैट्स द रियलिटी. एवरी चाइल्ड इज वेरी डिफरेंट. ऑल किड्स लर्न डिफरेंटली. Their learning styles are different. So inclusion का मतलब भी एक्नॉलेज करें कि बच्चे एक दूसरे से बहुत अलग हैं और हमें सीखना पड़ेगा कि अलग अलग बच्चे को किस तरीके से हम पढ़ाएं कि सब बच्चों को इंटरेस्ट वहां पे मेंटेन रहे. That's the most important idea. The next important idea, inclusion is not about finding weaknesses of learners. It's about finding strengths of all learners. तो जब आप पढ़ाना शुरू करते हैं, ये नहीं कि भाई यार ये बच्चा क्या नहीं कर पा रहा, ये बच्चा क्या नहीं कर पा रहा, बल्कि दूसरा काम करना है. बिकॉज क्लास इज ऑलवेज हाफ फुल. यहाँ पे आपको ये पता करने की कोशिश करनी कि भाई ये बच्चा कर क्या सकता है, व्हाट कैन ही डू, व्हाट कैन शी डू, एंड देन बिल्ड ऑन दिस. इस तरीके से आपको ये पता करना है कि भाई इस बच्चे वीकेंड को क्या खेलता है, ये अपने भाई बहन के साथ क्या खेलता है, ये अपने अगर गाँव में है किस तरीके की एक्टिविटीज इसको ज्यादा करनी पसंद है, इसके इंटरेस्ट क्या क्या है. अगर ये सारी नॉलेज हो जाएगी आपको, then it becomes easier for you to include anyone. So what it means is everybody, Einstein talked about this, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. तो अगर आप हमेशा, अगर मान लो एक बच्चे को देख नहीं पा रहा है और आप उस बच्चे को हमेशा एक ऐसा टेस्ट दें जिसमें उसको देखना बहुत जरूरी है, हर बार वो बच्चा फेल होगा क्लास के अंदर. लेकिन ऑन द अदर हैंड अगर आप चेंज कर सकते हैं अपना, बोलेंगे कि अच्छा ठीक है ये बच्चा देख नहीं पाता, मैं इसको दूसरे तरीके से टेस्ट करता हूँ इसकी नॉलेज, इसको सुनता हूँ कि क्या पता है मेरे को बोल के समझा दे कि क्या समझा है, तो वो बच्चा दैट विल बी सक्सेसफुल इन दैट क्लासरूम. इट रिक्वायर्स यू टू थिंक आउटसाइड द स्क्वायर. दैट्स व्हाट इंक्लूजन इज ऑल अबाउट. So my next question was, does Pakistan face the same barriers as the rest of the world? I showed you that slide and I showed you lots of figures of people who have done that research. And what I'm saying is that's good. The research is good, but now we need to forward. I mean, I'm not saying to ignore that research, but what I'm saying is we need to do new kind of research in Pakistan now. And then I'm going to share the kind of research we should be doing to make our schools more inclusive. So one of the things is, if you really want to change and make your schools and classrooms more inclusive, you need to ask, this is a good research question to ask. What is working in my system, my school and my class? What is working in our system in Pakistan, in our schools in Pakistan, in our classrooms in Pakistan? And then you need to identify those things and then build upon this. So I got a picture of a person here who's trying to look for gold. I don't know अगर आपको पता हो कि gold जब लोग ढूंढते कैसे करते हैं, रेत के अंदर gold होता है, ये चट्टानों में है, लेकिन what they do is they go start looking for gold digging. They use water and different kind of techniques and then they find gold. Same thing I think researchers need to do. You have some great practices in your school. Provided you start asking the right question, you will be able to identify. So you need to find that gold in your schools and system. I think some of you will say, well, there is nothing good in our schools. I don't think I will agree with you. There is lots of good things in our school. You need to find it. So these are some of the right questions you need to ask if you are a teacher or if you are a researcher. Most importantly, if you are a teacher, this is the question you should ask. How can I make sure that to engage all learners? How will I know if all students are learning the content? How will I find out if some students find the content too easy or too difficult? How can I motivate all students to learn? How can I find out if I'm a good teacher? Who will tell me? How can I modify the content to ensure all students have access to the material? How best I can involve parents and carers? And how will I determine what should I teach, what makes, and then the next one is what makes great teachers. इसमें काफी सारे questions हैं. I think one of the most important question, and something if you really, I don't know how many of you are teachers here or some of those you want to watch it later. If you do one thing that will make you a much better teacher than what you were yesterday is to ask your students how good you are as a teacher. And ask that in a way you cannot identify who is that student who told you this. You can do it a very easy exercise. Ask अपने students को बोलो कि can you please write about 3 things about my teaching. 1, that I do really well. 2, that you think I can do better than what I have done in the past. 3, is there any way I can include you in my teaching, the way I teach and involve you. And ये वाली 3, अगर ये 3 questions का answer आप you take on regular basis for 1 month or every week you should start doing it, I can tell you all those people, I mean you will fix your classrooms, you will make it much better classroom for all children. If you want to do it better, ask their parents. You can send these 3 questions to parents. उन पेरेंट्स से पूछें, भाई मैं आपके बच्चे को पढ़ा रहा हूँ पिछले 3 महीने से और 6 महीने से 3 साल से, मैं आपसे जानना चाहता हूँ कि आपका मेरे बारे में क्या ख्याल है, मेरी टीचिंग के बारे में. अगर आप में हिम्मत है ये वाला क्वेश्चन पूछने की, I can guarantee you don't have to read textbooks to become a better teacher. You will be a better inclusive teacher in your own system. So if you really want to ask these questions, they will make you a better inclusive teacher. And there are, I mean, what I was very, very happy to see, when we talk about inclusion, like, people say, Umesh, can you send us some samples from Australia, how you are doing it? I said, and when I go, I mean, I haven't been to Pakistan, but I'm sure when I go to Pakistan, I'll be able to find some great practices there. You need to make video recordings of those schools to share what you are doing in those schools and share with other teachers so that they can learn how they are making their classrooms inclusive. So this is just some good schools, some great stuff happening in India. But what I want to highlight, these are not private schools. वो वाले स्कूल नहीं है जहाँ पे लोग हजारों रुपए दे के अपने बच्चों को एडमिट करते हैं. ये गवर्नमेंट स्कूल्स हैं और इन स्कूल्स की स्टोरी इतनी पावरफुल है जहाँ पे टीचर्स आर डूइंग ग्रेट स्टफ विद देयर किड्स. I think that's what we need to be doing. Good researchers, that's what we need to be doing, finding those practices in our school system that show the strength of Pakistan to the world. That's the kind of stuff you should be doing more and more. So this is the kind of stuff I'm asking for researchers to do. So think of yourself as gold digging, like you are going to look for gold in your school system, in your classroom, in your country. Once you have done it, you'll find some gold. But gold is just, this is a starting point. You need to go beyond this to make it a jewelry. What you need to do is you need to write papers that people will understand in Pakistan, not in Australia, in a language that teachers will understand. You need to write papers, and those could also be video, YouTube channels where you can share those stories. And that's the kind of jewelry we need from Pakistan for people to share. So what I'm suggesting, rather than doing more research on what barriers Pakistan faces, I think you need to move forward. Now you need to start sharing stories of what's working in Pakistan. That's the kind of research you should be doing more and more right now, if you really want to, because we already know the barriers. We don't need to know anymore. And I have done it. I have written those papers, attitude के बारे में काफी लिखे हैं, लेकिन they are not helping us move forward. We need to have better research projects where we talk about positive practices now. The third lesson I want to share with all of you is, how do we prepare teachers for inclusion? And I have to say, this is, whether you are in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, or to some extent even in Australia, we have struggled with this area. How do we prepare teachers for inclusion? And I did talk about some of the problems that we have faced. But if we really want to move forward, we need to have a different system. So there is very powerful theory by Michael Schulman. He talks about that teachers need to have a heart, head, and hands of inclusive educators. अगर आपको इंक्लूजन करना है तो 3 चीजें चाहिए, आपका दिल, दिमाग और हाथ. ये ट्रायंगल है, ये मेरा आइडिया है. What I want to say is, पहले दिल पे काम करना चाहिए, यानी कि लोगों को विश्वास होना चाहिए कि इंक्लूजन इज गुड, इट्स एन अपॉर्चुनिटी फॉर मी. फिर हेड इज नॉलेज, व्हाट काइंड ऑफ स्किल्स डू आई रिक्वायर, दैट्स द सेकंड थिंग, यू नीड टू डू इट. एंड थर्ड थिंग इज, हाउ डू आई प्रैक्टिस. सो दोस 3 थिंग्स शुड हैपन. हमारे टीचर एजुकेशन प्रोग्राम में तीनों चीजें होनी चाहिए. लेकिन व्हाट आई कैन टेल यू, व्हाट आई नो, all over the world people spend a lot of time on teaching head knowledge. We do not spend enough time on hands or on heart. But वो तीनों चीजें होनी बहुत जरूरी हैं अगर हम टीचर्स को प्रिपेयर करना है इंक्लूजन के लिए. If you want, I have written a paper which talk more about how do you go about doing that in greater detail. It's freely available online, so you can access it. You don't have to subscribe to Oxford University or Oxford Encyclopedia. So I really briefly want to share about how do you change teachers का heart, head and hand. पहली बात, किसी का दिल चेंज करना और किसी का बिलीफ्स चेंज करना आसान नहीं है, बहुत मुश्किल काम है. बोलना बहुत आसान है, उमेश, कहना तो कि भाई it's easy to change, but it's really hard how to do it. Again, we have written about this. How do you go about it? So I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm going to give you some tips that you can use in your own program when you are doing inclusion. पहली चीज, when you teach, start telling teachers the truth. The truth is, आपकी क्लासरूम में बच्चे ऐसे जरूर होंगे जो आपको प्रॉब्लम होगी, जिनको पढ़ाने में आपको दिक्कत आएगी, आसान नहीं होगा उनको पढ़ाना. तो that's the first thing you want to tell, you want to teach in your program. So start with this story that people, you don't have to say everyone is going to behave really well and that's how you're going to teach. They need to know that you will face problem when you start teaching. You will have kids जो आपकी बात नहीं समझ पाएंगे जब आप पढ़ाओगे. तो क्या करोगे? कुछ बच्चे होंगे जो मिसबिहेव करेंगे, तो क्या करोगे? कुछ बच्चे होंगे जिनको दिखने में थोड़ी प्रॉब्लम होगी, कुछ बच्चे होंगे जिनका कॉग्निटिव लेवल लो होगा. तो आप अपनी टीचिंग को कैसे चेंज करोगे, ये बताना उनको बहुत जरूरी है. They need to learn this. This is the most important truth they need to learn if you really want to change their heart. And then talk about this is an opportunity. If you can become a better teacher, if you can teach all children, you'll be a much better teacher. So what I mean to say is, अगर आप किसी तरीके से उनका दिल बदल दें और उनका सोचने का ढंग बदल दें कि इंक्लूजन इज अपॉर्चुनिटी है, तो एटीट्यूड चेंज होता है. Anywhere in the world, this is the cheapest way to create an inclusive classroom. That's the most important thing we need to learn. And I have lots of other ideas that I have shared in that paper, and you're most welcome to read that or get back to me if you want to know. Once they start believing in that idea, अगर आप teacher education program में थोड़ा you have spent some activities, the next thing is the next question is what kind of knowledge do they need to acquire? And this is another area that I have found there is some problematic. We spend a lot of time teaching content that is meaningless in teacher education. Like आप पढ़ाते हैं बहुत ज़्यादा, and I can tell you one thing that we do a lot in different countries. We teach lots of characteristics of children with disabilities. We teach characteristics of children with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. Actually, those characteristics will never tell you how to teach that child because each child is different. So what you need to do is अपने जो टीचर एजुकेशन प्रोग्राम है उसके अंदर हमें अलग चीजें पढ़ानी ज्यादा जरूरी है. Number one, and these are the kinds of things we should do in our teacher education program. Number one, teach them that all learners are different, not some learners are different. And teach them how will you find out the strengths of those learners. Second thing, how will you know what to teach? And I'm not saying that just the content, like books to hand textbook. What to teach means, अगर आप एक पर्टिकुलर विलेज के अंदर है, how will you make the content meaningful and interesting for the student? So इसका मतलब क्या हो रहा है उस गांव के अंदर या उस शहर के अंदर, क्या फेस्टिवल्स हैं उस टाइम, वो जानना बहुत जरूरी है. कनेक्ट करना बहुत जरूरी है. बच्चे क्या करते हैं वीकेंड को, वो बहुत जरूरी है, उससे कनेक्ट करें नई नॉलेज. हाउ विल यू नो इफ ए लर्नर हैज लर्न द कंटेंट? इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग इज आइडिया. जब टीच करते हैं इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि मैंने पढ़ाया और काम खत्म. इसका मतलब ये भी है कि बच्चों ने समझा नहीं समझा. कुछ हैव यू नीड टू हैव सम सिस्टम एवरी डे इन योर क्लासरूम दैट यू कैन यूज टू फाइंड आउट वेदर दे आर लर्निंग द कंटेंट और नॉट. हाउ विल यू मोटिवेट ऑल लर्नर्स? देयर विल बी सम लर्नर्स जो आपसे जब पढ़ाएंगे बिल्कुल इंटरेस्ट नहीं है, यानी कहेंगे इट्स सो बोरिंग, व्हाट डू आई डू. उनको कैसे मोटिवेट करोगे, वो भी जानना बहुत जरूरी. ये दिस इज व्हाट वी नीड टू टीच इन आवर टीचर एजुकेशन. हाउ विल यू इन्वॉल्व पेरेंट्स एंड अदर स्टेक होल्डर्स? आप पेरेंट्स के साथ कैसे काम करेंगे, उनके साथ मिलकर बच्चों का एजुकेशनल प्रोग्राम कैसे बनाना चाहिए, उनको इन्वॉल्व कैसे करना इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर यू टू डू. हाउ विल यू अडेप्ट द करिकुलम एंड हाउ विल यू पर्सनलाइज द कंटेंट. So this is if you can do these 6 or 7 things in any teacher education program anywhere in the world, I think that's what the most important thing is. You have done a very good job. But the next thing is context is important. So what does it mean? अगर आप कोई रिसर्च आर्टिकल दूसरी कंट्री के अंदर पब्लिश किया यूज कर रहे हैं, आई थिंक हमारी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है टीचर एजुकेटर्स की, भाई इसका ट्रांसलेट करें. इसका मतलब क्या है हमारे पाकिस्तान के अंदर, हाउ विल यू अप्लाई दिस. So that's very very important for us to do when we teach. The last thing is आपको heart हो गया, head हो गया. Now next thing is how do you change practices, the hands thing. For this, once again, what we tend to do is, जैसे हम बच्चे, I don't know what पाकिस्तान में क्या होता है कि when teachers are getting training, we send them for placement to learn about the content. What I'm asking you to do is to send them in difficult schools, not in easy schools. Those schools जहाँ पे ड्राइविंग बहुत मुश्किल होगी उनके लिए. ऐसी असाइनमेंट्स करें, उन बच्चों को बोलिए कि you are going to face the problems, but I want you to go and identify those problems, but also I want you to say आपने वो प्रॉब्लम्स कैसे एड्रेस की, आपने कैसे उनको अपने यानी कि टीचिंग के अंदर आपने एड्रेस करके अलग तरीके से पढ़ाया बच्चों को, वो मैं जानना चाहती हूँ. और जो बच्चा अच्छे से दिखा पाए, that student should get the highest marks. But the most important thing is you need to share those experiences with the rest of the class. And that's where the learning happens. That's where the change happens. That's the kind of stuff you want to do a lot in your teaching. The second idea is, university or schools, they are two different worlds. आपको university में बहुत theory करते हैं, school के अंदर practice. तो अगर आपको ये चेंज करना है कल्चर, व्हाट यू नीड टू डू इज समहाउ यू नीड टू हैव अ वेरी गुड पार्टनरशिप विद स्कूल्स. सो व्हाट डज इट मीन? आप स्कूल टीचर्स को बोल सकते हैं कि भाई स्कूल टीचर आप आके हमारे साथ पढ़ाएं यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर, हमारे स्कूल जो हमारे स्टूडेंट्स है ना, you come and co-teach with us in the school system. So that's the kind of idea where school teachers can teach with you at the university, or you can teach with school teachers in their schools. So those two partners need to come together, and we do it here in Australia. We have written about it and we have seen it makes a difference. Attitude change होते हैं, knowledge change होती है, practices change होती हैं. And the next idea, it is impossible to prepare teachers with heart and hands if we can't bridge the gaps between universities and schools. So very very important. अगर आप टीचर एजुकेशन में रिसर्च कर रहे हैं, आपको सोचना पड़ेगा भाई कौन कौन से स्कूल्स हैं जिनके साथ हम पार्टनरशिप शुरू कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि जब तक your graduates do not learn how to drive on real roads, you'll find it very very difficult to translate theory into practice. So it's important for you to start thinking about. So now I'm coming to the last slide, conclusion. We need to build on our strengths rather than our weaknesses. So think about Pakistan already has lots of strengths. वो strengths क्या क्या हैं, उनको पता करें. Gold digging वाला मैंने example दिया, find those things and build upon them. The 3 key lessons I talked about: redefining inclusion, ask right questions, and teach teachers with heart, head, and hands. And always remember, context is critical. So पाकिस्तान को ना भूलें, अपने context को ना भूलें. जब भी कोई नया आइडिया है, सोचें कि ये आइडिया कैसे implement हो सकता है हमारी country के अंदर. And the last thing is, or second last thing, it does not matter if the glass is half full or half empty. Be grateful that you have a glass and there is something in it. So I would like to say thank you to all those people, because your glass is already half full. That's why you came here to learn more about it. So, and I hope that I have given you some tips to make you a better teacher or a researcher or a teacher educator. Thank you very much. And if you have more questions, you can always email me. And then what I'll do is maybe I'll stop sharing now. Yes. And any questions that you might have.
Yes. Dear audience, if you have any question, please write it in the chat box, or you can directly talk with the speaker. Zubair, you raised your hand. You wanted to ask something to Dr. Umesh?
Zubair is not here, I think.
Yeah, it's okay. I have a couple of questions from you, but let me conclude your talk. So Dr. Umesh actually concluded his session with inclusive education means inclusion of all the vulnerable children in school, including children with disabilities and children who are out of school, children living on the street, and minority groups. And real inclusion involves a gradual realignment of a school entire program, and it is the joint responsibility of both Ministry of Education, it's a Ministry of General Education and Ministry of Special Education, to cater for the educational needs of children with disabilities along with other vulnerable groups. Well, I have a question from you, Dr. Umesh. Zubair, would you like to ask a question? You raised your hand initially.
Yes, ma'am. I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question like before the intermission, Umesh sir said how to handle the wrong attitude of the teachers during the class. So in the slide we were talking about attitudes of teachers in handling the class. So I have a question regarding that. How we can handle being a teacher or being a student if a teacher is having wrong attitude. So how can we handle it?
Yeah, so, he's talking about the negative attitude. Yeah.
Yes.
Zubair, can I ask you what do you do? Are you a researcher or a teacher or teacher educator?
I am a researcher, also a student in masters.
Okay, Zubair, very good question. But can I tell you, it's the hardest question. I mean, it's one of the hardest thing for us to do. When you start thinking about changing someone's attitude, is not easy. First of all, I want to acknowledge this. So we have done a lot of research. When we talk about why people have negative attitude, I tell you why people have negative attitude. People have negative attitude when they do not know how to do this thing really right. And I talked about this. Attitude are influenced by your own training and your, so think about अगर आप यूनिवर्सिटी में आपको किसी ने बताया नहीं कि भाई इंक्लूजन कैसे करना है और आपको बोला यार टीच करो जाके उन बच्चों को जो आपने कभी सीखा ही नहीं, तो आपका attitude is more likely to be negative about those children. Okay, so one of the things that I talked later on when you left was, if you really want to change people's attitudes, first of all, the important thing we need to do is the teachers को समझना जरूरी है कि to teach a child who has learning difficulty is an opportunity. It's not a challenge. अगर मैं इस बच्चे को अच्छे से पढ़ाना सीख जाऊं, So it will make me a better teacher. That's the first important thing that teachers need to learn. The second thing is teachers need to learn what are the kinds of skills do I need to acquire to teach a child who may have different kind of difficulties. So that's the teacher's responsibility. But teachers ऐसा है कि टीचर तो बेचारा अकेला आदमी है या एक अकेली टीचर है अपनी क्लास के अंदर. अगर वो एटीट्यूड उसका इसलिए भी होता है क्योंकि उसको सपोर्ट नहीं मिलती है. अगर वो करना भी चाहती है या करना चाहता है इंक्लूजन, तो ना तो स्कूल प्रिंसिपल से सपोर्ट मिलती है ना पॉलिसी से सपोर्ट मिलती है. तो सपोर्ट उन टीचर्स के लिए बहुत ही ज्यादा जरूरी है. और जो हमने रिसर्च की अभी तक इंटरनेशनली, actually there are two major kind of support teachers need or resources. One, they need extra time in planning. Number two, they need access to expertise. वो वाले रिसर्चर जो अगर मान लो अगर I'm teaching a child with a challenging behavior, so what I need is, can somebody tell me what to do with this particular child because I don't know how to teach this child. So I hope I have answered your questions. I think it's a not an easy question. It takes time, but it requires.
Yes, you are right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, you are right. So you have talked right now about inclusion of teacher, but I have a question regarding that also.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask another question?
Sure, please.
Okay. So the teacher is responsible, in all the ways during inclusion method.
Yeah.
Am I right? So why
Yeah.
they don't have any support? You said they don't have any support of government or during during teaching. You said just a minute ago. So is there any way like they can cooperate with the student to manage their cognitive needs or something like that?
Yes. So we did talk about few of the
Basically,
things.
I'm researching on cognitive needs based teaching during the mentality of boys and girls during the lecture or something. So that's why I have a question regarding this. Your topic is
some of
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I may not be able to answer your question straight away, like what you can do about those particular students. But there is one approach I talked about, which is called reflective practice or reflective teaching. What it requires, where when you teach, you ask your own students what do they think about your own teaching. So rather than asking students like, you can say, I did talk about there are 3 different kinds of questions you can ask your own students. Do you think what I'm teaching is making any difference to you, or do you understand the kind of content I'm teaching? Number 2, do you think I'm a good teacher? So teacher is asking more information from the student. And I also talked about asking the parents of that particular student. They can also help you. So there are kinds of questions that you can use to become a better teacher for a child who might have cognitive impairments or cognitive disabilities. But the most important thing, you need to understand the strength of the particular student if you want to teach them well.
I got it. That's great.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Zubair. Well, Dr. Umesh, I have a question. What sort of training, in terms of developing positive attitude, and when we talk about the support, so what type of the support? It's a moral support or it's a personnel support? Do we need to cater the needs of the children with diverse need in the context of Pakistan?
So you mean training of teachers?
Yeah.
So I did talk about starting with the heart, head, and hands kind of framework.
Mm-hmm.
So think about you first. As you start teaching, if you are teaching a unit on special education or inclusive education, if you have 10 lectures or not 20 lectures, I would say 25% of your content should be changing teachers' beliefs. You say, do you believe in inclusion is a good idea or not? And be challenged. Ask them to challenge you, where they might say, well, inclusion is not a good idea. Ask them, why do they think so it's not a good idea? What are the kinds of problems they bring in your classroom? Because if you, we have designed a concern scale. You may already know about it. Teachers may have 4 major kinds of concern. Workload is a problem. I don't know how to teach this particular child. Let's talk about those concerns before you start teaching them the content. Because what you have done already is, first of all, you acknowledge it's not easy. Second thing you have done is, if you really want to do is, you have heard their concerns. And the second thing that we require, or the third thing you want to require is, जब आपको पता लग गया कि ये वाले concerns हैं, you need to address them in the head part of the program, where you will say, actually आपने ये वाले concerns बताए, and I'm going to tell you how will you address those concerns in our teacher education program. But then I talked about 5 or 6 different kinds of things you can do, learning the understanding the learner, involving parents, changing the content. That's the kind of stuff. And that applies to any country rather than just Pakistan. And the third thing is connection between head, heart, and hands, where they practice what they are learning. So partnership with those schools. आपको assignments change करनी पड़ेंगी अपने subjects की. Assignment will be more applied. It's not that you tell me what is cooperative learning. It will be how will you apply cooperative learning in your classroom and tell me whether it worked or did not work. So that's the application is more important than just the ideas.
I have felt here in the context of Pakistan, we intentionally don't identify the students with diverse need. I mean, we know this student is lacking in terms of some learning difficulties. He cannot read easily and he cannot write it easily. But even though we know all these realities, but we don't try in a realistic manner to identify such type of the learning difficulties. I mean, why?
Well, most important thing is, when you identify a learner with a problem, it also makes you vulnerable as a teacher. Because it means that learner is going to struggle in your classroom. It's better to ignore that learner rather than to acknowledge that this learner has a difficulty. But I think it's not such a big problem as such, because many a times it would be good for teachers to say, well, I know that I have this learner in my classroom, but to convince them that this learner is struggling in your classroom, it requires a cognitive shift in your thinking, because you need to acknowledge out of 100 kids in my classroom or 50 kids in my classroom, 10 are struggling. It's not just one learner who's struggling. Maybe there are 10 kids who will be struggling in most classrooms. Agar teachers मान जाएंगे these 10 kids are struggling in my classroom, what I'm going to do for those 10 kids, then it becomes teachers' problem. But for teachers to do this, they need to reflect. They need to ask questions from their student. It takes time. But we have done this research in Bangladesh, where actually we asked them, can you use this letterbox outside your classroom and ask your student to write it? What did they enjoy in your teaching every day? And you know what? Some students say, I did not enjoy anything today in my class. And there were smart kids in the school, not the kids who had difficulty. And it's not easy for teachers to accept it when smart kids tell you that they did not enjoy what you did. So I'm not worried about learners who are struggling. I'm worried about kids who are even, that's what I say. Inclusion requires, पहले आप उन बच्चों को पढ़ाना अच्छे से शुरू करो जो already हैं तुम्हारी क्लास में. उसके बाद then we start thinking about kids who are struggling. It requires a shift, but you will not believe, Sadia, in Bangladesh, when people believed and started using this strategy, it took some time for them to own this idea. But people who owned it, what we realized, actually those 50 schools where we did this research, they were the best compared to similar schools in other districts. In attendance rate बढ़ गई बच्चों की, parents ने जब participate करना शुरू कर दिया, and actually what you said, dropout rate reduced to 0 in those schools. But it required them to shift their thinking, and it required them to say that I don't know. As a teacher, which is not easy for any teacher to say.
Yeah, you are right. Bangladesh is progressing with the inclusive concept. They have done good work.
Yeah, they are doing better than Pakistan and India, I can tell you.
Yeah. They're very active. Dr. Umesh, you have shared your experience by using the age theory, hands and head and the heart. Do you have any example to share with us where you implemented this model and how we can practice the same model in the context of Pakistan, and what support do we need to apply such type of the age practice model in Pakistan?
So the model that I was looking in Bangladesh is a good example. What I might do is I'll give you a link to that and I'll put it in the Google chat. And that might be something that you can share.
So it was your experiment, and how long did you take to implement all the age practices?
It was a 3-year project.
Okay, 3-year project.
Yeah, okay. It does not things don't happen so quickly. Inclusion is not, it's a process. It does not happen like 6 months.
Yeah. I really want to implement that model in the context of Pakistan.
I just shared the link to that, where actually we got an award for that project for this particular project from Zero Project. It's in Vienna, United Nations office for this particular project.
Okay. Okay. So
But
maybe. Yeah.
So the idea behind this, we use hard hand and hands framework. The idea, the way we work with the Ministry of Education identified 50 schools. They said we want to change, we want to implement inclusion here. Ministry of Education ने क्या किया? They identified people working in that district level, but also who work with school principal. उन लोगों को लेके आए. So we train the master trainers. We say actually if you want to do inclusion, first of all you need to believe that inclusion can happen. Because अगर वो ही नहीं believe करेंगे तो teachers कहाँ से believe करेंगे और school principal कहाँ से करेंगे? So we started with trainer, master trainers. We also got NGOs जो सी वहाँ की थी जहाँ पे special schools से उनको भी involve किया because हमें पता था कि they need to come in this partnership. So they came on board. Then Ministry of Education came on board, and then we started training. The first training was where people challenged me. They asked me very difficult question in Bangla, English, and Hindi, whatever, and I really liked it because there is no point moving forward अगर वो believe नहीं करेंगे an idea में. So we spent some time. Once I got a sense that 80% of people believe that inclusion is good, then that's a and let's start talking about the head part. How would you do it? And then we say we will not give you many strategies. We'll give you 4 or 5 teaching strategies. If you do this, you'll see a difference. But you need to change what you have been doing. So वही वाला idea जिसमें अपने letter box लगाओ अपने कमरे के बाहर बच्चों से पूछना शुरू पेरेंट्स से पूछो उससे we saw a lot of difference happening. And then there was a video. I mean, I don't know. I have the link to video or not, but actually you'll see. Perhaps I can quickly show you that video, and then you can see what we could achieve. That, but and then okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Let's wait for a second. I'll see if I can find that. So I'm going to show you this video quickly. Let's see if I need to share this.
আমার স্কুল গেছিল না, এখন যায়। আমার স্কুল খুব ভালো। আবার জানতোই না যে স্কুলের জন্য কিভাবে কাজ করবেন আগে। আমার তো মহিলা জানা না, এখন কিন্তু সবকিছুই জানা। এই এলাকার সব বাচ্চাদেরকে স্কুলে নেওয়ার দায়িত্ব আমাদের। আমরা স্কুলের জন্য কাজ করে এসেছি।
এমনটা ছিল না, প্রতিবন্ধী শিক্ষার্থী ছিল না, আজকে তার এখন তারা নিয়মিত স্কুলে আসে এবং সব জায়গায় যেতে আমরাই করেছি এসএমসি স্টুডেন্ট কাউন্সিল এবং আমরা শিক্ষকরা
একই সচেতনতা, কিছু বিষয় জানা, ব্যাস পরিকল্পনা থেকে শুরু করে এই যে দেখছেন এই বাস্তবায়ন আমরাই করি।
এত বড় ক্লাস হচ্ছে আগে নিতে আমার হিমশিম খাইতে হয়, এখন আমার আর কোনো কষ্ট হয় না ক্লাস নিতে। এত বড় ক্লাস হয় না, এখানে আমার কোনো সমস্যা হতো না এখন ক্লাস নিতে। ও যে কয়েকটা কৌশল আমি জানছি, ও কৌশলের মাধ্যমে আর ছাত্ররা খুব মনোযোগী হয়েছে ক্লাসের প্রতি, তারাও খুব আনন্দ পায় ক্লাসটা নিতে, এই কৌশলে যদি আমরা ক্লাস নিই।
এরা হচ্ছে প্রতিটা সময় কাজ করতে পারে, সেটা আগে তখন যখন শুনলাম বিশ্বাস হয়, এখন আমি জানি এবং অনেক কৌশল শিখেছি,
প্রশিক্ষণ পেয়েছি, প্রক্রিয়াটি ছিল অভিনব, শুধু তত্ত্ব আর প্র্যাকটিস না, আমার যা সমস্যা তা নিয়ে প্রশিক্ষণ।
আমার মূল লক্ষ্য ছিল যেটা আমার সমস্যা সেটা সমাধান করা।
সুন্দর সুন্দর সব সমাধান সহজেই হাত পাস করাই এখানে বড় কৌশল।
ব্রেইলও শিখছি, সাইন ল্যাঙ্গুয়েজও শিখছি। আমি এখন যে কোনো শিশুর শিকল পরিচালনা করতে প্রস্তুত। এসএমসির অনেক কাজ, কিন্তু কাজগুলো যে ধাপে ধাপে কিভাবে করতে হয় সেটা আমি জানতাম। এখন আমি এইগুলোই জানি কিভাবে এই কাজগুলো করে একটা স্কুলকে ধাপে ধাপে অগ্রগতির দিকে নিয়ে যাওয়া যায়, একটা পাঁচতারা স্কুলে পরিণত করা যায়। আমি সেই লক্ষ্যেই কাজ করে যাচ্ছি এবং আমি আশাবাদী অদূর ভবিষ্যতে আমার এই বিদ্যালয়টা একটি পাঁচতারা স্কুলে পরিণত হবে।
আমরা শুধু এখানে আমাদের সাথে অনেক দল আছে, কমিটি সিস্টেম এবং আমাদের স্কুল ক্লাসমেটের সার্টিফিকেট গ্রুপ আছে, তাদের মাধ্যমে জানতে পারি কোন বাচ্চা স্কুলে আসে কি আসে নাই এবং স্কুলে যা কিছু সবকিছু আমরা আতেন না করি। আমি আমার স্কুলে ক্যাসমেন্ট এলাকা নিয়ে একটা পরিকল্পনা করেছি। এই পরিকল্পনা অনুযায়ী ক্যাসমেন্ট এলাকা 6টি ভাগে ভাগ করা হয়েছে। এক একটি ভাগে একটি দক্ষ টিম আছে। এই টিম শুধু
So as you can see, I mean, it's another 5 minutes, but I think you get the idea, yes?
Yeah, that's really wonderful.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyhow, thank you so much, Dr. Umesh, for joining us today. And on behalf of University of Education, thank you so much for accepting my invitation and conducting a great session on inclusive strategies and developing positivism to address the needs of the learner with diverse need. Thank you for sharing the useful way to introduce the inclusive classroom practices in the context of Pakistan. And thank you once again. I'm looking forward to meeting you in a future in person. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye bye.